Montana Territory, spring of 1882. The wind howled across the open plains like it carried the ghosts of everything she had lost. Veronica Hale tightened the leather strap on her worn satchel and stepped off the westbound freight wagon, her boots sinking into the muddy soil of the small cattle town of Dovetail. Her dress was dust-stained, her hands chapped and raw, but her eyes storm blue and wide held steady as she walked straight through the open gates of Farnham Ranch. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her last coin had gone to the wagon driver. She had nothing left but her name and the will to keep moving. She spotted him near the corral, breaking a young Mustang. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, dark curls falling to his neck as he moved with calm control, one hand firm on the reins, the other guiding the horse's trembling head. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like the kind of man who had dug his own land out of rock and wind. When he dismounted, the horse still huffing behind him, she crossed the yard without stopping. "Please take me," she said, voice cracking. "I will work for free. Just give me a place to sleep and something to do." He turned, eyes narrowing as he took in her thin frame, the hollow beneath her cheekbones, the desperate way she clutched her satchel like it might vanish too. "You got a name, miss?" His voice was deep, clear, and not unkind. "Veronica Hale. I can cook. I can sew. I'll clean every inch of this place. Just please do not send me away." He studied her like a man who had seen too many liars, then stepped forward. "You are the woman I have been waiting for," he said simply, like it was already decided. She blinked, breath catching. "What? I will not take your work for free," he added, his voice softer now. "But if you are offering honesty and heart, I have room for both." His name was Vaughn Fletcher, and the moment she heard it, something in her chest settled. He showed her the bunkhouse first, then the kitchen. The ranch was large but quiet, with only a few hands riding the outer fences. He had no wife, no children, no one waiting. Just a house too big for one man and a land that needed more hands than he had. By sundown, she had already cleaned the scullery, mended 2 shirts left in a basket, and stirred beans over the stove like she had done 1,000 times back in Missouri before everything fell apart. He watched from the doorway. "You always work this fast?" he asked. "If I stop, I think too much," she answered, not looking up. He nodded like he understood. That night, she sat on the edge of the bunkhouse bed, staring out the small window. He had given her a blanket, a proper meal, and a roof. She wanted to trust it, but the last 2 years had left their mark. Her husband had died in a mining collapse outside St. Louis. His debts had swallowed their home. Her 2 boys, Micah and Matthew, had been taken in by a church orphanage when she could no longer feed them. She had tried to get them back, but no one gave work to a widow with nothing. She had come west because it was the only direction left. The next morning, she was up before dawn. Vaughn handed her coffee without a word. They worked side by side in silence, him repairing a fence, her helping hold the posts. When her hands bled, he wrapped them in cloth without asking. When she stumbled carrying a load of kindling, he caught her arm and steadied her. "You do not have to break yourself to prove anything," he said. "I do, though," she whispered. "It is all I have left." He did not argue. Over the next few days, she found rhythm. She patched curtains, learned to ride a little, and helped Vaughn sort the spring cattle. He asked few questions, but always listened when she spoke. One afternoon, while hauling water from the well, she paused and looked out across the hills. "Do you think people can start over?" she asked. Vaughn leaned against the pump, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "I think it is the only way anyone ever makes it out here." She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. That night, he found her sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "I asked around," he said, hesitating. "There is a reverend in Butte. Runs a boys' home. Said he knew of 2 brothers, Micah and Matthew Hale. Said they are still there." Veronica dropped the mug. It shattered on the hearth. "They are alive?" she choked. "I can take you there." She stood, breathless. "Why would you do that for me?" He stepped closer. "Because no one should carry that kind of ache alone." She stared up at him, heart pounding. "You are kind." "I am not kind," Vaughn said, his voice low now. "I just know what it is to wait for something good, and I think it might be you." Her chest tightened. She did not know what to say, so she did not say anything. But she did not look away either. They left at dawn the next morning. It was a hard ride, but Vaughn kept the pace steady, always watching her from the corner of his eye. He shared his jerky and laughed when she cursed at the rocks cutting up her boots. When they made camp by the river that night, she leaned against him without asking. He let her. By the third day, they reached Butte. The Reverend greeted them kindly. And when he brought out the boys Micah, thin and tall for 12, Matthew, quiet and clinging to his brother, Veronica fell to her knees and pulled them both into her arms. I came back, she whispered into their hair. I promised I would. The Reverend asked if she had means to care for them. Vaughn stepped forward without hesitation. They will come home with us, he said. I have land. I have space. And they have their mother. Veronica looked up at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. You are giving me everything. No, he said, touching her face. You are what I have been waiting for. And right there, in front of the boys and the Reverend and the sky wide above them, she kissed him. Just once. But it was enough to say everything. They rode back with the boys on horseback, laughter slowly returning to Veronica's voice. Vaughn showed Micah how to hold the reins, and Matthew clung to her waist the whole way home. And when they reached Farnham Ranch again, it finally felt like something more than a place. It felt like the beginning of everything she had lost and found again. The first week back on the ranch was quiet. Veronica rose before sunup, her boys still curled beneath wool blankets in the loft Vaughn had cleared for them. She moved through the kitchen with quiet purpose, grinding beans, kneading dough, tending the firebox, her movements measured as if afraid too much sound might break whatever thin peace had settled over them. Micah kept to the porch when not helping Vaughn with the horses. He watched everything, shoulders drawn, eyes cautious. Matthew stayed close to his mother, trailing her footsteps and clutching the buttons of her skirt when strangers passed too near. Vaughn never asked questions about what the boys had seen or what they feared. He handed Micah an oilcloth and showed him how to clean a saddle. He let Matthew sit beside him while he mended a worn bridle, giving the boy the task of holding nails in his small palm. He didn't speak much, but the boys leaned toward his silence like it offered shelter. One evening, after the boys had gone to sleep and the last of the dishes were stacked to dry, Veronica stepped out into the yard. She found Vaughn seated on the edge of the well, fiddling with the buckle of his boot spur. They don't know how to play anymore, she said, her voice low. They will, he replied, not looking up. Takes time. She folded her arms tight against the cooling wind. I keep thinking I'll wake up and they'll be gone again. It happens so fast. One day I was their mother, the next, I was no one. He set the spur aside and stood. You're not no one. Then, softer, not to them, not to me. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away when he stepped closer. The night smelled of horses and ash and something faintly sweet, maybe wild chamomile growing at the edge of the field. A coyote called from beyond the ridge. She tilted her head back and looked at the stars. I don't know how to rest, she admitted. Even now, it feels wrong. Then don't rest yet, he said. Just be here. He didn't touch her, but the space between them hummed with something that hadn't existed a month ago. Something careful. Something choosing its shape. The next morning, Vaughn came in from the north pasture with a basket full of eggs and a splinter in his palm. Veronica took his hand without hesitation, pressing his fingers open to find the shard. He hissed through his teeth when she tugged it free with the tip of her needle. You should wear gloves, she said, wiping the blood away with a strip of linen. I do, he said. Sometimes. She glanced up. Why not today? He shrugged. Didn't think on it. She set the needle aside. You think on everything. His eyes held hers longer than she expected. Not everything. Not lately. That afternoon, the sound of hammering came from the east side of the barn. Micah stood on a stool, carefully nailing 2 planks together. Vaughn was beside him, holding the beam steady. What are you two up to? Veronica asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Micah didn't look up. We're building a coop. For what? Chickens, Vaughn said. He thinks we should try keeping some. Micah's mouth twitched at the corners, not quite a smile, but close. Veronica stepped back, her throat tight. The last time she'd seen Micah build anything, he'd been trying to make a toy boat out of scrap wood and twine. That had been before. Will it keep them warm through winter? She asked. Not yet, Micah said. But it will. Vaughn touched the boy's shoulder. He's got a good eye for angles. Just like his father, she said, then cursed herself for saying it aloud. Vaughn didn't flinch. Then he can teach me something. That night, she found Matthew asleep in Vaughn's old rocking chair, a half-whittled stick clutched in his fist. She lifted him gently and carried him to the loft, her fingers brushing his hair back from his forehead. Downstairs, Vaughn had lit only one lamp. He stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the dark. "You could have sent us on our way," she said. "Most men would have." "I didn't want to," he replied. "That's not the same as saying why." He turned. "Because you walked onto my land with nothing but truth between your teeth. Because you didn't ask for sympathy, only a chance. Because I've had this house filled with silence for too long, and now there's bread in the oven and boys in the yard, and you." He stopped, jaw tightening. She stepped closer. "And me?" He looked at her like the words had weight. "You make it feel like a home." She didn't reach for him. Not yet. But she stood close enough to feel the warmth from his chest, to see the rise and fall of his breath. The clock ticked from the mantel. Outside, the wind moved through the wheatgrass. "I don't know how to be someone's again," she whispered. "Then we'll figure it out slow," he said. "No one's rushing you." She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the ground beneath her feet hold steady. They didn't speak again that night. But when he walked her to the bunkhouse door, his hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away. And when she lay down between her boys, their breaths soft beside her, she closed her eyes and let herself believe for the first time that she might not have to keep running. The last frost passed quietly, melting from the fence rails in thin rivulets that soaked into the early grass. The valley softened with the season's turn, and with it came a new rhythm. Not hurried, nothing on Vaughn's land ever was, but steady, woven of shared work and unspoken understanding. Veronica stood in the garden plot behind the bunkhouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, nails dark with soil. She pressed her boot heel into the earth and turned up a furrow for the carrot seeds clutched in Matthew's hand. He knelt beside her, brow furrowed in concentration. "Even rows," she said gently. "Not too deep." He nodded and dropped the seeds in, one by one, slow as prayer. From the barn roof, hammering echoed. Vaughn and Micah were laying fresh shingles. Micah crouched low, Vaughn guiding his grip on the hammer. They didn't speak much, but Micah's back sat straighter than it had weeks ago, and from where she stood, Veronica could see the way he listened. Later that evening, Vaughn passed her a folded cloth bundle at the supper table. Inside were 2 spools of thread, one brown, one slate blue, and a small pair of sewing scissors. The handles were smooth, the blades still sharp. "I traded the McCready boys for those. Figured you could use better than what you've been working with." She ran a finger over the steel. "You didn't have to." "I know." He took a sip from his cup. "I wanted to." Veronica studied him across the table. The lamplight caught the creases near his eyes, the faint scar along his temple, the way he never fidgeted but still looked like he was always listening to something beneath the surface. "You ever think of marrying?" she asked. Vaughn didn't flinch. "I did once. Years back." She left before the first frost. "Why?" She said, "I love the land more than I could love her." Veronica glanced down at the scissors in her lap. She was wrong. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. The next day brought wind and the first signs of prairie lupin along the ridge. Vaughn rode out before sunrise to check the southern grazing line. Veronica packed him a biscuit wrapped in cloth and handed it off without meeting his eyes. "We'll be here when you get back," she said. He nodded once and took the reins. With Vaughn gone, the ranch held a different quiet. The boys followed her through chores with a new energy, Micah inspecting the hens' nesting boxes, Matthew tugging a splinter from the laundry pole. Veronica found herself humming as she worked, a tune she hadn't thought of in years. At midday, she let the bread rise longer than usual and carved a sliver of honeycomb she'd tucked away in the pantry. When Vaughn returned near dusk, dust streaked his coat and the horse's flanks. He dismounted with a grunt and handed Matthew a small bundle tied in wax paper. "Found wild plums about 5 miles out. Thought your mama might know what to do with them." The boy ran inside, hollering for a jar. Veronica stepped into the yard, arms crossed. "You've been riding all day, and the first thing you do is hand off fruit. You always make something better out of nothing." He shrugged. "Figured I'd give you something." She studied him a long moment. "You're not afraid of giving." "No, even when it doesn't come back." He looked toward the barn, where Micah had just lit the lantern. "It does now." That night, after the boys were asleep and the dishes had cooled on the drying rack, Veronica stepped outside. Vaughn stood under the cottonwood, arms loose at his sides, eyes on the stars. She walked to him slowly, her hand closing around his. "I want to stay," she said. He turned to her, something unguarded in his face. "I hoped you would. I'm still learning how." "So am I." They stood like that a long while, not speaking, her head against his shoulder, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. The air smelled of cut hay and wood smoke, the kind of night that settled into the bones. And when he kissed her, it wasn't sudden or sharp. It was slow, like the earth warming beneath thawed snow, like something that had waited long enough it didn't need to hurry. When their lips parted, her voice was quiet against his chest. "You said I was the woman you'd been waiting for." He nodded. "You still are." And in that hush between words, between the heartbeats that had carried them here, she understood something that hadn't fit before. Love could grow in silence, in steadiness, in the space where no one asked for more than what was already freely given. Behind them, the windows of the house glowed soft and golden, and the land stretched wide and open, waiting for the life they'd build together. The roof beams above the kitchen creaked softly in the warming air, swollen from the spring thaw. Veronica stood by the window, drying her hands on her apron, watching Micah and Matthew chase each other through the scrub grass near the creek bend. The boys had begun to laugh again, not constantly, but enough that the silence no longer pressed so heavy between them. Vaughn stepped through the back doorway, brushing hay from his sleeves. "Elias Cormack's coming by tomorrow. Wants to talk about leasing pasture." She turned, brow raised. "You ever done that before?" He shook his head. "Never needed to. But the north field's grown thick enough to carry more weight than we've got." She leaned a hip against the counter. "You trust him?" "Not exactly," he said, voice even. "But I know what he wants. And I know what I won't give." She nodded, then turned back to the window. Matthew found a bird's nest in the rafters. "Did he touch it?" "No. Just looked. Said the eggs looked like river stones." Vaughn stepped beside her, his gaze following the boys. "He's got a quiet way of seeing things." "They both do." She wrapped the towel over the sink rail. "I want them to grow up knowing this place is theirs." "They will," he said, "long as I've got breath." She looked at him then, not startled, but struck by how simply he said it. That night, after the boys had gone to bed and the lamps were out, she climbed the narrow stair to the loft above the barn. Vaughn was already there, oiling the reins, seated on an overturned crate. She crossed the space slowly, the lantern flickering behind her. "I've been thinking," she said. He set the strap down. "About what?" "About staying in the house," she said. "With you." He stood, not quickly, not with surprise, but as if the words had reached something he'd already made room for. "You sure?" "I am." He stepped closer. "Then you're welcome." She touched her hand to his chest. "Not just for the boys. For me." "I know," he said. They moved into the house together 2 days later. She brought her things in a single wooden chest, her sewing kit tucked between folded linens. Vaughn cleared a drawer without her asking. Micah and Matthew took to the change without protest, Micah more reserved, Matthew eager to sleep under the same roof as the man who had taught him how to carve a whistle from pine. That Sunday, Reverend Beach rode in from town, his coat dusty, his mare favoring one leg. Vaughn met him at the gate. "She threw a stone," the Reverend muttered, dismounting. "I came to check on your boys." "They're doing fine," Vaughn said. "And they're not just mine." Veronica stepped out onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. The Reverend straightened. "I heard tell of what you gave up to get them back," he said. "Some say a woman like you ought to be in town, with a roof already built and neighbors close." "I had neighbors back east," she replied. "Still lost everything." He scratched his chin. "And what have you found here?" She glanced at Vaughn, then at the barn, then toward the creek where the boys were skipping stones. "Enough to stop running." The Reverend nodded once, then tipped his hat. "Then I reckon you don't need my advice." That evening, Vaughn brought out an old fiddle from a cedar case beneath the bed. He ran a cloth over the strings, tuning it by ear. Micah watched from the hearth, his mouth parted in quiet awe. "You play?" the boy asked. "Little," Vaughn said. "Used to listen to my mother hum along." He drew the bow slow, the first sound thin, but the second steadier. The tune was unfamiliar, deep, winding, full of space between notes. Veronica sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. When he finished, Matthew clapped once, then buried his face against her knee. "Play it again," Micah said. Vaughn did. And the second time, it sounded like it belonged to them. Later, in the hush of their room, Veronica unpinned her hair and set the brush aside. Vaughn sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, fingers folded over his knee. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder. "Every morning. I mean for us. This place. The boys." He stood and drew the curtain closed. "I think we build something. Not quick. Not loud. Just real." She crossed to him, hands at his collar. "And if I want to marry you?" He stilled. "You do?" "I do," she said. "But not for safety. Not for land. For you." He cupped her face, his thumb just beneath her cheekbone. "You've been mine since that first morning. I just didn't speak it. Then speak it now. I love you," he said. "And I want you beside me, always." She leaned into him, her lips brushing his. "Then I'm already yours." And when they lay down that night, the quiet between them was not empty, it was full of everything they'd built from the ground up. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, soft and steady, like a promise kept. The air turned warmer still, pushing into early June with the scent of wild sage and sun-warmed pine drifting up from the ridge. Veronica stood on the porch with a needle between her fingers, stitching a patch onto Matthew's shirt. The linen was soft from washing, thread pulled taut in small, even lines. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her eyes kept lifting to where Vaughn was hitching the wagon near the barn. He glanced up once and tipped his hat toward her, then tied off the last strap and stepped onto the porch. "Thinking we ride into town today," he said. "Mike is due for a proper pair of boots, and I want to speak with the registrar." She paused her sewing. "The registrar?" "For a marriage license." He said it plainly, without hesitation. She smiled, lips pressing together as her eyes softened. "And the boots are just an excuse?" she asked. "No. His toes are bleeding through the seams." She set the shirt aside, stood, and brushed her hands on her apron. "Then I'll pack bread and apples. We'll need the whole day before the sun drops." They left before noon, Matthew nestled between them on the wagon bench, Micah riding horseback beside the rear wheel. The road to town wound along the riverbank, cottonwoods heavy with green above them, water flashing silver through the reeds. Veronica leaned into Vaughn's shoulder as they rode, her hand resting lightly on his knee. Town was louder than the ranch, but still modest, a scattering of homes, church steeple, dry goods store, and the scent of fresh-cut lumber from the mill yard. They hitched the team outside the mercantile, and Vaughn lifted Matthew down before helping Veronica step from the wagon. Inside, Micah tried on a pair of boots that came up sturdy and dark to his mid-calf. He walked the plank floor with quiet pride, then nodded once at Vaughn. "They'll do," he said. Vaughn paid the clerk and turned to Veronica. "I'll see the registrar while you visit the seamstress." She touched his arm. "Don't let him talk you into anything fancy." "I won't," he said, and left with Matthew's hand in his. At the seamstress's shop, Veronica chose a bolt of soft blue calico and let the woman measure her shoulders while Micah stood by the door, arms folded. "You want buttons up the back or front?" the seamstress asked. "Back," Veronica answered. "I'll have help." When Vaughn returned, papers folded in his coat pocket, he found her waiting by the wagon, eyes bright beneath the brim of her bonnet. "We're to be married Friday," he said. 1 o'clock. Reverend Beach agreed. She reached into the basket and handed him an apple. "Then I'd best bake early." They rode home as the sky shifted color, the sun drawing low and gold across the hills. Micah dozed in the wagon bed, boots beside him, and Matthew leaned against Vaughn's side, thumb tucked in his fist. Veronica rested her cheek on Vaughn's shoulder, watching the road unwind beneath the wheels. Friday came cool and clear. The cottonwoods shimmered in the breeze, and the boys wore brushed jackets with fresh collars. Veronica dressed in the calico blue, buttons fastened by Micah's careful fingers. She braided her hair and tied a white ribbon at the end, then stepped from the bunkhouse into the waiting light. Vaughn stood near the steps of the porch, coat clean, boots shined, his eyes never leaving her. He didn't speak until she reached him. "You look like spring," he said quietly, "like something that came through the cold and lived." She took his hand. "I did." Reverend Beach spoke simply. There were no guests beyond the boys and Mrs. Lyle from the neighboring homestead, who brought a jar of plum preserves as a gift. The vows were spoken without flourish, just truth and steady voices. the wind carrying their words across the grass. Afterward, they ate bread and honey on the porch, and Vaughn poured coffee while the boys played tag near the fence line. Veronica watched them run, then turned to Vaughn. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she said. He took her hand. "You made it happen. Not alone." "No," he said. "Not anymore." That night, after the boys were asleep and the lamps burned low, she leaned against him in the quiet of their room. "Do you think it's foolish, hoping it'll always be like this?" she asked. "No," he said. "But even if it changes, we'll face it together." She nodded and drew the quilt higher over them. "Then I'm not afraid." Years passed quietly, marked by planting seasons and birthdays, by fences built and calves born in spring mud. Veronica and Vaughn worked side by side, their hands rough with labor, their laughter soft but frequent. She taught Matthew to read by lamplight, and Vaughn built a second stall when Micah took to raising a gelding of his own. When the boys grew tall enough to ride out alone, they did so with the same steadiness Vaughn had taught them, returning each dusk with dust on their boots and stories beneath their tongues. Veronica never left the ranch again. She didn't need to. Everything she'd lost had come back to her in new shape, earned, not returned. She sewed in the evenings, the blue calico dress folded in a cedar chest, and watched Vaughn mend harnesses with silver hair at his temples. On their 10th anniversary, he carved her a comb from walnut wood, the grain smooth and dark. She wore it every Sunday. They grew older, but never apart. And when they sat together in the evenings, watching the boys work the land they would one day inherit, Veronica would rest her head against his shoulder, same as she had that first ride home, and say nothing at all. She didn't need to. Everything she'd ever wanted was right there beside her.